All right, Adam, thanks so much for coming. I'm excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, great to be here.
So, you've been busy on this campaign introducing the idea of focused research organizations, and now you are actively building them. Maybe you could start out with your elevator pitch for focused research organizations.
Sure. And you can think of it at a few different levels or layers. I'll maybe give you a couple, but um, maybe the simplest way to describe it is that we believe that there's a class of scientific research problem that doesn't fit perfectly in the existing organizational structures that predominantly are where research happens, including academic labs, startups, for the most part, corporate research labs, or even national labs. And the characteristics of this type of research problem is that it requires a scale of team science or engineering, kind of very tight knit, organized, managed team developing with laser focus a single system of some kind. Could be a data set, could be a tool. Um, but that system is not something that uh, traditional venture capital, let's say, would readily find a way to monetize, or in some cases it could just be a pure public good. It could be a data set that you want to release,
Mhm.
but you need a kind of startup like laser focus, unity of purpose, and intensity of operational execution and management,
Mhm.
that you would find hard to do in the more individual discovery focused environment of a university, where it's more about individual scientists rather than a team or a single product or system being developed.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, when did you one of the reading through your background, the thing that jumps out to me is you've spent time in, I would say, all the best possible places for doing research, right? At MIT, the media lab, then you go and you're working at startups like Kernel, and then you're at DeepMind, the kind of the one of the best, if not the best, corporate research centers. So you were there in the room at the places and with the people who are tasked with kind of discovery and inventing the future. Um, and having been there, you still kind of found this hole of organizational structure that didn't exist. So I'm kind of wondering where along the lines you kind of got the idea that maybe something new needs to exist.
Yeah, it's a great question. I sometimes describe it as, I didn't feel like a perfect fit in any of those, but it's also that I saw so many positives from some of those, but then I wanted to apply the positives from one, combine them with the positives from the other. So I would say that if you sort of go back through my history of interest, when I was a teenager, I was reading sci-fi books and kind of speculative science books, and I had a maybe very idealized view of how science would be organized. It was pretty clear to me that, if you had the right idea and the right problem, maybe there would be some sort of federation of scientists that would figure out, how to make that work. And we would be just limited by people being smart enough, to come up
Mm-hmm.
with the right ideas. And so at the time I was studying, theoretical physics, and I kind of went through my undergrad in this mode of like, probably, science is working pretty well organizationally. We just have to like really deeply understand things and come up with great ideas and get excited about them, and then, the system will allocate, resources and so on. Well, I was then lucky enough to be in a very high freedom graduate school environment. So I had a high freedom fellowship, high freedom advisor, high freedom department. Really could in principle do anything I wanted as a graduate student. um, I felt like in graduate school, I was always interested in things that were biting off much more than I could chew. as an individual researcher. And part of it was, of course, my own skills, and everyone goes through this of, you're trying to learn how to do research, and it's challenging. But oftentimes I would say, well, really, if we could just get the right 20 engineers on this problem, and
Right.
and get the right resources, and have a roadmap for this, then these things we want to do, they're not too complicated. And I was working on very ambitious things. We wanted to try to map the activity of all the neurons in the brain. This was early in the Obama Brain Initiative getting started, and my advisor George Church was involved in some of that. And that continued with my working, with some of the most innovative researchers, I would say, in neurotechnology and biotechnology, through the end of my PhD, and in a period where I was kind of a weird research scientist role, not exactly a postdoc, but trying to galvanize some of these larger scale projects. It was in that context, when we were both very interested, with Ed Boyden and others, in new optical technologies for mapping brain circuits, that my colleague Sam Rodriguez and I started really having discussions up more on the organizational side of, really what would be the best way to organize different parts of this project. And
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we came to the conclusion that there was a certain breakdown of expertise, scientists, engineers, technicians, operational management, and so on, that would be needed to really execute well on this. And then the question was, how could we get that going?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we basically struggled, and that's what ended up leading to our saying, here would be the ideal thing if the government or someone would fund these types of structures, which are now what we're calling the focused research organizations. That was the
Right.
original motivation there. In the intervening period, there were a number of things that I think contributed to that, being top of mind, including the fact that I spent some time in, I think, a very exciting brain-computer interface startup that was funded by, a high net worth individual, Brian Johnson. I saw what that looked like, how quickly
Mm-hmm.
they could hire people, how much dynamism of the organization they had, how quickly it was, to sort of get support, on things both operational and strategic, as well as kind of, just raw scientific technical support,
Mm-hmm.
to build out projects, where it felt like a very enabling environment. At the same time, it was very product focused,
Mm-hmm.
and a number of the questions that we were interested in, like fundamentals of brain circuit mapping or things like that, those were things we couldn't easily do,
Mm-hmm.
at this company, because it was not part of their plan for going to market. And then at DeepMind, I would say it is really a remarkable place, and
Mm-hmm.
it does have some of the best of both worlds. I felt like, as a researcher there, in some ways it was more academic than academia, in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that you could really just focus on the theoretical work and the computational work, and a lot of the things like writing grants or so on was taken off your plate. It was very good. You could just go in and write code all day, and have write on the whiteboard all day. It was a very good
Right.
environment. And then occasionally, when they wanted to do a focused team effort, then they had all those people ready, and they had the management support. So when they did projects like AlphaFold or AlphaGo, they could draw on that community of researchers who was already there and say, hey, now you're going to like really push on this one project, and really switch the mode of how that was working for some finite period of time. Um, Actually, Mohammed Al-Qarishi, who's a professor at Columbia, who works on protein folding, he wrote in a blog post that, uh, basically he thought the AlphaFold team at DeepMind was a great paradigm for some kind of new, um, research model, which is, to me, is effectively something like an FRO. He called it a fast and focused,
Right.
research model. And I think, yeah, that fast and focused team model, where they had 18 or 20 co-first authors on that AlphaFold paper.
Yeah.
um, Neither of us was the first to notice that that's a really great model for certain restricted class of problems. And so
Mm-hmm.
then, circling back to the kinds of issues we were facing with brain mapping, I had been at DeepMind, but Sam was still working on some of those questions in the
Sure.
Boyden lab. And then we kind of got this white paper out and published, and started working on it as a for me as a full-time job to try to get that, funders to actually pay attention to that.
And they did.
Yes.
So have you been surprised by the uptake? What were you expecting back when you published the paper?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say, I guess I must have been naively optimistic in order to sort of drop out of everything and start working on, full time on the funding side. There were a number of galvanizing forces for that, including the fact that we felt like there was a kind of time limited opportunity where, as we were just going into the last presidential election, I started working on this full time, maybe 5 or 6 months before, the November election. And the idea was, the start of a new presidential administration. And I sort of was very influenced by Tom Khalil, who provided me with a fellowship to work on this, kind of right at the right time, that the beginning of a new presidential administration would be a very interesting time to try to influence scientific priorities. And, things like COVID were sort of a wake-up call also in terms of, were we running the scientific research establishment in quite the right way? So there was clearly some opportunity for change with the beginning of new administration. I think I've been definitely pleasantly surprised by the uptake from philanthropists. I would say the thing that I'm most happy about actually in this, or that I think is maybe should have been obvious, but was not entirely obvious to me, is that, I don't think that focused research organization concept, you sort of say it's a sort of a startup like nonprofit that does a very particular milestone driven, time bounded, research agenda. That's the kind of the general idea. There's no rocket science in that. It's a very simple idea. So it's not like, anybody should be too surprised, but by this concept. But what I find is it's very useful for eliciting certain kinds of interest from people that matter. So even if someone's project is not a perfect fit for an FRO, it could be an imperfect fit for any of the existing models in other ways. And by saying, hey, do you want to propose something like a focused research organization? It could be unusually large scale. It could be unusually focused. You could have a custom designed team. You could be supported to kind of build it however you wanted. If you say those things to people and then you say, okay, and we're only going to do this for certain problems that pose a very particular bottleneck and they can't be done in other ways. And therefore, it would be worth the time of philanthropists to fund in this new mechanism. Just by asking that question, then you get both funders and scientists to propose ideas that currently, they're maybe not thinking about as much, because why would they if there's no solicitation you can apply for? People are busy. Why would you spend your time writing a kind of mythical proposal for something where there is no mechanism? But as soon as someone spends full time and goes and says, well, what if you had this, could you even spend 20 minutes of your time or an hour of your time thinking about, what would you do there? I do find that it's generative, and it's a good way of creating a match between people, ideas and projects, and making it more likely that all of those things co-occur, that there's a funder that's interested in something of this size and shape, and someone is also proposing something of this size and shape. So very weak perturbations to the system of just sort of asking a question or floating a relatively obvious concept of a sort of semi-independent startup-like nonprofit for a particular research problem. Just by floating this relatively obvious concept with the right level of kind of seriousness by which you go about that, it actually quite generative for pulling people out of the woodwork.
No doubt about it. I mean, that's one of the things that's been surprising to me over the past year is the importance of just naming and prototyping new ideas. Like, you guys put out this idea of FROs, and I think you've obviously started to build them out. Other people are taking the idea, kind of iterating with it. I think Fast Grants is another good example. Like, okay, Fast Grants worked for Patrick and Tyler did it for COVID, but we're seeing like a number of iterations on that. I've had like a not the same level of kind of uptake, but but some with this science angel idea, like having distributed funding where scientists have agency and they can make decisions quickly. Um, it's been surprising to me just how important those kind of new names have been, just so the funders can all of us, say yes to something.
Yes.
Um, because there is pent up demand from both scientists to do this and funders. It's just they needed this kind of matchmaking of terms that could get run by the legal department first, and then they could be comfortable with it. So that's been surprising to me.
I agree. Yeah, that's I think my biggest lesson, or currently what I'm taking is the biggest lesson here, because I think different funders will end up having different detailed interpretations of the FRO model. You can imagine a number of different ways of implementing it, different scales, and so on. But uh, the value of sort of loose, weak coordination mechanisms for just increasing the probability of otherwise rare events, constellations of a lot of these things are about having the right set of people sharing an idea and then sharing that with a funder who's receptive. And I think it's never going to be that it's just automatic. Press a button and here's your FRO created. But it also wasn't obvious a priori sort of how tight the feedback loops are against it. Is it that funders would never be interested in that? Is it that
Yeah,
academics would never be interested in that? No, it's really more that you have to just get a flywheel going where people start thinking about that, and that's the optimistic take so far. Yeah.
totally. So I want to take advantage of this moment in time because I think, a year ago you wrote this paper or whatever, a little bit longer than that. And, you were describing the idea, and in a year or two, you'll have this kind of retrospective, here's what we've learned. But right now you're at the beginning and you're learning a lot, I'm assuming really quickly. And it's interesting because you went from 0 FROs to now you have a handful that you're involved in. So you're almost like in this meta position where you're trying to think about how to make these many of them at the same time. So how are you thinking about what are you learning from a meta level about this? And like, how are you thinking about the portfolio of these different endeavors?
Yeah. I think that I actually expect that for the next several years, there will be a lot of continued experimentation and different kinds of interpretations of this. What we're doing now with this convergent research entity, it's kind of like an umbrella organization that provides some shared backend services. And also it provides kind of centralized organization for searching for new ones. I think that that's going to ultimately allow us to sort of focus on some of the more core issues, less about the logistics and operations, although we're doing a huge amount now to sort of spin up the first few. But ultimately, a lot of the questions are the same as you would have in startups. How do you have the right set of roles and relationships on a team? What is going to galvanize people to want to join one of these projects, and all the things kind of other than the idea. Of course, we started by just interviewing a lot of scientists and saying, do you have some idea that isn't a fit for traditional grant mechanisms, but requires you to build some sort of integrated system where you require a team. So we started with sourcing a lot of ideas. It's obviously going to be a much smaller fraction of those that where the team is ready and set up. But I think we're also going to be able to develop practices for that. We may be able to systematize some of these ideas of sort of co-founder dating. If we have a set of scientists who understand what the idea is, can we pair them with a COO or CEO, who would be ready to help build out the operations and the partnerships and the transition plans and so on for that organization. I also think that there are going to be even now multiple different interpretations. So we have two FROs that are getting started now through convergent research. Um, we also have uh, what I would call a FRO inspired project, which is called the Rejuvenome. It's about aging
Mhm.
biology, and that's run through the Astera Institute, where they've ended up choosing a different model, but I think it's still close enough
Mhm.
that it embodies many of the characteristics. It's a de novo project with this de novo management and everything, with a time bound, finite systems goal, where you kind of have to reconfigure, who is doing what, and hire dedicated staff. So in that sense, it's very much like an FRO, but that's being done, you know, partly through the Astera Institute, and then in collaboration with the Buck Institute for research on aging. So is that an FRO, or is that FRO inspired? This is a case where I think eliciting the general idea, then people find their own interpretation. So I'm
Mhm.
also not sure that there's going to be a fixed answer to how to do it, so much as we're just trying to elicit a number of solutions which will kind of anneal in their own right way. Some of these other funders might choose to do for-profit companies that they then do program related investments or sort of philanthropic style investments in those.
Mhm.
There are a number of experiments that are yet to be done, so I'm excited for both us and others to be learning these things.
Mhm.
um, and I'm not sure that anything that we have was going to perfectly generalize across all the possible cases, but we're certainly making progress. One of the things we've learned is how hard it is to find lab space.
Oh,
In some
really?
of these markets, we're just closing the lease for one of the FROs, and um, you learn about lots of practicalities, and you start to understand how some of the other entities in the space are working. Like a lot of big venture firms have basically bought up a lot of the biotech lab space in the Boston area, kind of in preparation for their next round of companies that they're going to be creating. So there's a lot of practical details too, sort of how to get ahead of lab space or things like that.
Interesting. Interesting. Um, I've been, I'm kind of writing, I've got a half-written essay about scenius. Are you familiar with the term, the
Yeah.
Brian Eno term
Yeah.
about and the literature is actually really interesting. There's not much. It's one of those things where if you describe the concept, this idea of this genius that emerges from small groups, um, anyone who's been a part of these scenes immediately understands this to be true. The kind of the magic of what those groups are. And
Yeah.
I've been a part of them before, and once you've been in them, you like nothing else matters. Like this is what you want to do, is be a part of these kinds of groups. And it sounds like you've been a part of that, talking about kernel and DeepMind. It's
Yeah.
once you've seen it, you want more of it. And it's kind of, the Warren Bennis has Organizing Genius, and there's collaborative circles. There's a few books that have been written about this, and there's kind of an open question around, can you manufacture it?
Hmm.
And you know I don't know that you can, but I think you can kind of, I don't know that we know the recipe, but I think we know the ingredients. And what's your take on that? And how do you plan to give these FROs, these groups, the highest chance possible of finding that magic? What insights do you have there?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I don't fully know the answer. I mean, one of the things that I've been pondering, I'm curious your take on it. There's been many instances in the past where someone has thought about this kind of science better kind of concept. When Genelia Farm HHMI campus was founded, that was itself a kind of one set of foundations, sort of diagnosing what was going on with the NIH funding of biomedical research, and then trying something new with lots of money and people getting excited about that. um, I have this feeling that right now we are in a unique moment
Mhm.
for this issue of institutional diversification of science. Um, but I'm not sure if it's an illusion. And this has just been going on, and people have been trying things, and I'm just happening to do FROs now, and you're doing science angels and other specific things now. I have a pretty strong sense though that we are in the beginning or middle somewhere of a scene being created around this where there is more critical mass. Um, and I do really think that that for what we want to do is really important. Um,
Mhm.
I remember thinking about some related issues almost a decade ago, back in 2012. You know, and at that time there were other things. You know, there was the Teal Fellowship, and there was Y Combinator was becoming really serious, and there was a certain kinds of scenes. But I don't think that we managed at that time to really solve these questions for basic research. I think that was a lot of people migrating to Silicon Valley and sort of testing out startup models and what can the startup model be applied to. And I think
Mhm.
we're in a different moment now where we're actually kind of saying, okay, well, we've learned a lot from that, but then how do we actually do this for more fundamental research and earlier stage research? Um, I think it will be important to try to create a scene. It would be ideal if people could go from one FRO to another, or from one FRO to another FRO like project, and where the question wouldn't always be, if I do this, I'm taking this risk because this is this outlier activity, and then what are the people who are still in academia going to think of me, or what are the people who are in the more traditional industry world going to think of me if I do this, right? It
Mhm.
should, ideally it should instead be that um, there's enough landing pads afterwards, and there's enough launch pads at the beginning that you can do that. I see a lot of evidence of this being the case. A lot of people have said, oh, it's going to be so hard to recruit for FROs because you don't offer tenure and you don't offer equity in a high growth company, and so on. Um, my counter to that is that, you know, there are 9 billion people or something on the planet, and there's a huge
Mhm.
amount of talent out there, and there's a huge amount of interest in these problems. And I am optimistic that there's a similar kind of flywheel where you create a scene in this way.
Yeah.
Whether that actually happens is yet to be known, but I haven't yet seen a contradictory force, except for people saying, "Oh no, this is risky. I don't know if this is going to work."
Mhm.
But for the most part, that hasn't played out. We haven't seen people saying, "Oh no, I could never," you know, for the most part, you know, I could never, you know, join an FRO, or you know, this is too risky, or what will I do after? That's not actually the main question that we're getting. We're getting questions about the details of how these things are going to be set up, but
Mhm.
I'm optimistic that uh, we're in the process of seeing a scene be created, but it's a little bit hard
Mhm.
to tell maybe until, you know, after the fact. So I'm curious your take on whether this moment is qualitatively different than 3 years ago or 5 years ago for this kind of activity.
Yeah. Okay. You want my take?
I do.
Okay. I think it is. I and I think it's really exciting for a few reasons. I think the ingredients here are actually kind of compelling. So, on the one hand, you have a kind of a group of scientists who I think, in a way that wasn't necessarily true, 10 years ago, are fluent. And I think this is because of the proliferation of startups, right? Like Y Combinator and just the factory setting that we have for cranking out startups. I think you have a generation of scientists who are fluent in both science and academia and that track, and also are also fluent in technology and the startup track and things like that. And I think what a lot of people are starting to realize is that we have these kind of institutional walls. you know if you're on the academia track, you're trying to get tenure and you only care about publishing papers. If you're on this technology track, you only care about you know getting product market fit and getting series B and going public. And I think Juan Benet of Protocol Labs has this really good like diagram of this. He calls it the chasm. And I think there's a lot of people who've been on both sides. You are like a prime example of this, who are like, wait a second, these institutional walls we've created have a huge gap in the middle, and they don't really need to exist. It doesn't need to exist. We don't need to have these walls here, right?
Yeah.
And I think it'll be much more effective to have people who can move between those worlds, can understand the mechanisms of grant funding and academia, and sharing scientific ideas, and then also going and building tools. and using economics and markets to kind of shape that. I think that's a really profound difference, is the fluency of some scientists and a growing number to bridge that chasm. The second thing is I'm wildly optimistic about some of the crypto wealth I've seen be created. And I say that like in my interactions with Jed and Astera and Juan and the Protocol Labs team. Like everyone talks about Web3 from the history of Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. Like, there was, the internet, and then there was social, and then now we have this decentralized internet. I think the right way to look at Web 3 is a much longer it's a much longer horizon and a much longer context. So the history of technology is actually, there's these people called standards entrepreneurs, and there's a great book. I interviewed the authors called Engineering. The book is called Engineering Rules, and it talks about the importance of standards entrepreneurship. And we always have this. There's people, it's like not, techno capitalism, it's like techno cooperation. And the standards entrepreneurs, agree on the ways that we're going to build things. And this kind of thing always happens before big industries. Like Tim Berners-Lee is a good example, but creating the shipping container is a good example. Creating the railroads and like time and like standards entrepreneurship is really important. The standards entrepreneurs are almost completely lost to history. Like they're not famous. It's a group setting. It's quiet. All of a sudden, for the first time, the people who are making the protocols are also the ones who are creating the wealth. That's what's happening now. I mean, like Vitalik and Protocol Labs. Protocol Labs had a meeting last week called Funding the Commons. I think it should be like noted by everybody that, like these folks are, building this wealth, but they're also actively trying to figure out entirely new ways to fund public goods. Like yes. I just can't remember that, like any other waves of entrepreneurship and wealth creation that were this focused on improving broader societal and civilizational systems as quickly as this group has. So they're setting a really interesting tone. And I know you've worked with these groups, I've worked with them. They're setting a tone that I think the kind of the other philanthropists, I mean, Schmidt Futures, of course, is doing really awesome stuff. Like there's the vanguard of philanthropic groups who are pushing the boundaries too. I think the combination of those things are opening up the frontiers for people like you and me to experiment and try new things that I think is really exciting. So I think those are the two big forces that I see contributing to a kind of this time is different moment. And I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a generation of scientists who don't think, like I think if you're 22 or 20 and you're thinking about a career in science, I don't think you're going to be thinking about this track of, okay, I need to get my grad, I need to be a graduate student here and then postdoc. And like, I think people are going to have a more holistic view of it. Like, okay, I know I want to do research in this area, but maybe I'll start a few companies or spin off companies. And I want to, focus on, this aspect of science communication and make sure, I'm affecting society at large. I think we're going to see a bumper crop of full stack scientists, and those are going to be the new heroes. And I think they're going to, anyways. So that's what I
share a lot of those pieces of evidence that maybe there really is a kind of scene effect, and I think part of what the scene is a kind of tacit level of trust or sort of ease of translation or ease of communication. And I think that it's very true that the crypto people who are basically working on deeply technical questions about institutional design, talking about new institutional models in science, it's sort of like you don't have to spend months, having dinners and kind of, trying to court a donor in that sense. You just talk about the substance, right? Immediately say, hey, we're trying to design this institutional structure for science, and here's how it works. And they'll ask concrete questions about that. There's sort of technical, sort of sharing that kind of technical or kind of object level understanding, rather than lots of sort of social protocols of how do you mediate between these communities. That's part of it. And then the other part that I agree with is as soon as someone starts to cross this barrier of sort of, I'm not on one or the other side of the chasm, but I'm willing to explore on the in between, then tweaking that, whether it's a startup or a focused research organization or a PARPA program or something else, or whether you're, doing actual VC funding or science angel funding, those things actually, it just becomes easier and faster. And sometimes things are just bottlenecked by, sorry, you can hear my baby in the background. Sometimes those things are just bottlenecked by kind of these low probability constellations of interactions, and just making those slightly higher probability to bubble up rather than by any fundamental obstacle. It's just a question of how likely is the few people get together and say, hey, maybe we should do a FRO together, and then go talk to this person, and these network effects. And so I think that's a lot of what the scene is sort of, you don't have to, you show up and people already know what you're talking about. You don't have to introduce it de novo every time, or face a lot of opposition every time you want to try something. And I am pretty optimistic that some of that is opening up as a result of, some of these things like Activate Fellowship or other kinds of things that are pushing, scientists to think more in entrepreneurial and structural kind of ways. And yeah.
Here. So one of the things we've kind of talked about beforehand, and is this idea of like a pipeline or talent issue. So if we want this kind of bumper crop of full stack scientists, I know that's going to be important for like the organizing talent at these FROs. What do we need in terms of the pipeline here? How do we get more folks excited about this? Have you thought about that? What can we do to help there?
Yeah, I'm going to try to go give an talk at Activate soon, and sort of take some of these folks that are on fellowships to think about how will they commercialize their research, and just sort of put the idea in the door. You might be able to have some of the benefits of teams and systems engineering and management and so on, even if it isn't ready to be commercialized, even if it is something that has a different purpose. I think there's enough overlap there. I also spent some of today, emailing colleagues, that have, done guest lectures or what have you in, business school classes or things like that, and sort of said, hey, can we tap your networks? We're looking for chiefs of staff, we're looking for COOs, to join scientists in some of these endeavors. So part of it is, harnessing existing talent. Part of it is what you said about just sort of opening up people's minds to trying slightly different things. But I think that it's unclear to me what, still whether we're funding limited or idea limited or talent limited. I sort of alternate, day by day of which it is. But what I've certainly heard is that once you get going on something, you're very quickly talent limited. And I think that's probably going to be the case. But at the same time, there are, I'm optimistic about basically fellowships, sort of giving people some time to have a kind of safe home base, and then think about what they would want to do next. We're also interested in with convergent research, and also Astera and others are also interested in this, is sort of supporting road mapping, sort of supporting people to deeply develop the idea of what could become an FRO, or what could be a bottleneck in science that could be fixed by something like that, and sort of explicitly supporting the idea development, because sometimes it's not exactly talent per se, but it's the match of talent of sort of, are we ready to make the leap and really directly propose something? How sure are we that we want to be working on this thing? And so I think that the scientific road mapping part is also something we want to very actively support.
So I like that a lot. And I think that kind of leads into some other questions I wanted to ask you, because you've just published on your blog a 3-part series around climate. And is that an example of the kind of the road mapping that you're thinking?
Yeah,
like
roughly. Yeah.
Okay.
That was something I was doing 2018, 2019 on my phone, kind of on the train back from writing code at DeepMind, mostly, this climate technology primer.
Yeah.
I think that that's even in some ways an earlier stage. I think we'd like to take, you can imagine starting there and saying, well, given what we've said of this background, sort of holistic understanding of what industry is doing, what academia is doing, what the open questions are in the field, why has the field sort of gotten where it's gotten, that kind of longitudinal analysis. My blog is called Longitudinal Science because I'm very interested in this sort of longitudinal cross-cutting systems level analysis of what's happening outside of any one particular person's research program. I think you could take that and say, okay, well, what's really the thing? What's really the ideal next thing for the world to do in fusion energy or in geothermal energy or in carbon removal or these kinds of things? And oftentimes you get to questions that are like, well, we could do this, method of enhancing weathering in the ocean or something like that, but the science isn't quite there yet, to support this. And then I think then the logical next thing to do would be say, well, what would be the really systematic, potentially quite expensive science project that people maybe aren't doing but would ideally do, to de-risk some of these at the basic science level. And then that's where your FROs are, basically. And also you can imagine companies and so on coming out of that, but
Right.
that's where your FROs are, is to sort of really pinpoint what's missing here, and then what's the really concrete thing that you should do. I have no idea who's going to do it. It might be a big schlep basically to do it, but then that's where I think you get FROs. And so we're interested potentially in like paying people, giving them fellowships or consulting to develop those roadmaps and also release them to the public as a kind of general tool for coordination. But then also we think that could lead to, increase the likelihood that a FRO proposal is submitted.
I think that's awesome. Those are incredibly, I'm so excited about the climate primer. I hope it gets a big audience, because I think it's great. And one of the things, I'll tell you kind of a short story. It's like, so we were, I've been working in ocean tech for the past 10 years, and it was interesting because we got in it by accident. We were building an underwater robot in Eric's garage, and we were just using Arduinos, and we put it on Kickstarter and raised some money. And then we got invited to all these ocean conferences, and they were all so surprised at what we had done. And you kind of see that there's these big blind spots in academia, especially around tools, and around what's possible, that I was just surprised that more people weren't thinking about it. And one of the things we did at So Far Ocean was we recognized there's this weird bottleneck in ocean technology, that's the connectors, right? Like the connectors are super expensive. That's where everything fails. And the reason we don't have low cost platforms like robotics and things like that is because all the sensors are super expensive.
Yeah.
If all the sensors are super expensive, you don't want to lose them. So you need expensive. It's this flywheel. And so we released we just announced this, an open source connector protocol we're calling Bristlemouth. And we got DARPA and a couple of philanthropic groups to underwrite us to do the documentation and release this open source. And we've got a bunch of groups coming online to use it. And it's one of those things where that took us 10 years to kind of figure out this weird bottleneck. And a lot of conversations like, why isn't anyone doing anything about this? And finally we got this kind of coalition to do it. So I love the idea of a roadmap as a first step, because sometimes it might not need an FRO, right? Like sometimes it may need a coordinated effort of just a few companies who already exist. And you can just put different, if we had that kind of map and picture, we can maybe solve these things without too much
Absolutely.
pain.
And not to speak for him, but I think that, Ben Reinhardt, who we both know, who's interested in privatized ARPA mechanisms, I think he also shares this kind of obsession with road mapping as a kind of loose coordination tool, because it helps you to identify what is actually the sociological landscape of what's happening in fields. And again, it's sort of very obvious, right? There's no rocket science, there's no Nobel Prize to be had for sort of writing down what different people are doing and how it categorizes and what they aren't. Here's some other thing they could be doing, but here's there's not that many papers about this. That kind of thing that we did with the climate technology primer. There's no rocket science to it. but it's one of these things that's sort of this loose, weak, perturbing force where it's just sufficiently not incentivized in the current system that it doesn't exist. But if you make it exist, then like, that can shift the balance. So hey, here's a PARPA program to be had here, just because of fairly obvious observations that you're making about what, the totality of what people are working on in a field. And
yeah, I think that's so great. So like, let's make this a thing. Road mapping should be a job that more people should have. Because I think just starting there, I mean, we're gonna, like this Bristlemouth thing, I haven't written this up, but the model that we did was loosely based on this, Michael Kramer, the economist who's won the Nobel Prize, has this paper that's not as popular about patent buyouts. Have you ever seen this?
I don't think I've seen that one.
So he's got a paper on patent buyouts, like this idea of like, well, maybe we should buy patents and release them into the public domain, which is a really good idea. But there's a bunch of ideas that aren't like for so far, like this connector, we'd been working on it. It's like, it's not that it's like our, like our core IP that's driving the company, but like we also don't want to invest the money and time to document it and go through the opening it up, just because we didn't have the, we're focused on other things. But if there was money there to like hire someone to really do the documentation and promote this, like maybe some ideas are closer to the public domain than they seem. And so like, I need to write this up, but like the idea is like, patent buyout light or something like that, where, maybe we need to, this road mapping, I think what it would do is it would lead to not just FROs and PARPAs or science angels, but I think we like, maybe let's have like a list of like new mechanisms that we can like pull to get through these different pathways to better coordination. I think because I think what you're doing with this kind of meta FRO stuff, what Ben's doing, I think we're gonna walk out of the next couple of years with a lot of these new tools. And like we were talking about earlier, just naming them seems to be like one of the most important things to do.
One of the things that we haven't entirely figured out how to do, and it's sort of, I think, much more challenging than it sounds at first, but would be great is, with this idea of road mapping, in principle, it's a sort of a fairly lightweight, from a financial perspective, fairly lightweight activity to support. And there's sort of this question of, how do you kind of build a community that has some shared kind of epistemics and kind of shared kind of background knowledge, such that you could just have the world kind of have less wrong for technical road mapping or something like that, just kind of emerge. I haven't yet figured out how to do that, because I think if that was just kind of autonomously emerging, then you would go even further, or maybe it's, I don't know, it's some of these other loose coordination mechanisms, the Hacker News in the Y Combinator kind of world or something like that. How do you get those to emerge? I think still we're planning on sort of explicitly identifying, sets of people that want to do this, trying to explicitly support road mapping, focus it on certain topics, at a meta level where we think there needs to be a roadmap. But ideally, this just kind of happens.
I know.
Yeah, and similar potentially for some of these issues around development of standards or other things.
Yeah. Well, I'm all for it. I think it's a great idea. I've found it really useful. I also found it inspiring. Like especially because my background is in oceans, and like I'm reading through it, going, oh, maybe if this is what's needed for climate research right now, like, here's some ideas I have for how we could overcome that. Like I think if it's just there, other people it's easier for them to see how they fit into that or could potentially contribute to that. Because I think we're missing a lot of low-hanging fruit. Like, so marine cloud brightening comes up all the time from like a geoengineering, like maybe we should do that. Meanwhile, like last year, these new rules went into effect where, and I forget the exact chemistry, but like all of a sudden, all these global shipping companies had to have removed like one of the major components that was like global shipping was effectively like a ongoing geoengineering project that's been happening for the past like 30 years. And we shut it off last year. And we had no instrumentation in place to kind of measure these changes. And it just feels like
Yeah.
things like that are like, that's something that so far could have contributed to, but it's like we're missing out on these opportunities because not enough people know they're there.
Yeah, I agree. And this is the kind of thing that I do think if more expert people would do things like the climate technology primer, that this would actually, it would be possible to make this more obvious. I mean, similar issues with, airplane contrails and bunch of things like that are happening, but that maybe aren't an existing academic research field to study what happens, or maybe this has just only happened once, so nobody studied that. But if you try to sort of just enumerate all the things, to tile through, right? Say, here are all the things that are perturbing this, let's look at each of those and try to really just be kind of brute force comprehensive about it. Then I think you find a lot of gaps. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that idea. Well, Adam, this has been awesome. Hopefully we can do this again in like 5 years after you've learned all these lessons, and we can do kind of a retrospective of what we both learned. I always end this asking folks what their ideas are what their best idea is for making science better. And if you have anything to add, you can. But I think you're living your best idea. So if you
Yeah,
want to leave it at that,
I'm thrilled with using FROs as a meta idea for sort of eliciting other more specific ideas. Yeah, I think that the one that just always comes up, it's not my idea. It's really just this notion that, why do we only have a small number of structural tools for organizing research when there's so many different kinds of genuinely different research? Why did we end up with a one size fits all approach? And once you start asking that question, I think you easily ask a bunch of other ones. And yeah.
Great. Well, we'll leave it with that. Thanks so
Awesome.
much for taking the time, and hope to do it again soon.
Absolutely.